Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going deep on Jack the Ripper,
Ooh,
one of history's most infamous unsolved serial killer cases. You know, the name probably rings a bell,
yeah, everyone knows the name.
but just to jog your memory, it's 1888. The setting is London's shadowy Whitechapel district, and a string of brutal murders targeting women is gripping the city.
Yeah, terrifying.
Exactly, terrifying. And the killer is just poof, gone, vanished, no trace.
Like he just disappeared into thin air.
Seriously. And today's deep dive is going to focus on one of the prime suspects, a guy named Aaron Kosminski.
Interesting.
Yeah. And we're going to be using excerpts from Aaron Kosminski on Suspect de Jacques Levanteur as our guide. And get this.
Okay.
There's DNA evidence involved. Could this be the key?
DNA evidence. Wow. Okay, so that's got to be pretty cutting edge for a case this old, right?
I know, right? I mean, could this be what finally cracks the case wide open?
Potentially. But, as we'll see, it's not quite as clear-cut as you might think.
Ooh, I like where this is going. But before we get to the DNA drama, let's back up a bit. Who was Aaron Kosminski?
So, from the information available, Aaron Kosminski was a Polish Jewish immigrant. Came to England around 1881.
Probably seeking, a better life.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
He ended up settling in Whitechapel.
Which, we just said that was a rough area back then.
Very much so. He worked as a hairdresser, though the records, they kind of suggest his employment wasn't the most steady.
So not exactly a picture of stability then.
No, not really. And sadly, things seem to have gone downhill from there. He began exhibiting signs of mental illness.
Oh, no.
Yeah. And by 1891, he was committed to an asylum. He threatened his sister with a knife.
Hold on a second. Threatening his sister with a knife, that's sending off some pretty serious alarm bells, don't you think?
Yeah, it definitely raises concerns. And
Yeah.
it makes you wonder about his potential for violence. It's a question worth exploring for sure.
Absolutely. So how does this guy, a struggling immigrant with mental health issues, end up on the police's radar as a prime Jack the Ripper suspect? Did those two incidents alone make him a prime suspect?
Well, not entirely.
Oh.
His name, it didn't surface as a serious suspect until years after the murders were over.
Really?
Yeah. A memo from 1894, written by Sir Melville Macnaghten. He was the Assistant Chief Constable of the London Metropolitan Police.
Big title.
It is. In this memo, he names Kosminski as one of three key suspects. Macnaghten described him as having a great hatred of women and strong homicidal tendencies.
Whoa. Great hatred of women. That's a strong statement. Was there anything specific to back that up, aside from the threat to his sister that made the police believe he was a danger to women?
It's a good point. We can't ignore the historical context here. I mean, there was rampant prejudice and anti-Semitism at that time.
Right, right.
And being a Polish Jew living in poverty likely contributed to the suspicion surrounding him.
Makes sense.
Yeah. But even with the potential bias, the fact that two high-ranking police officials, you've got Macnaghten and Assistant Commissioner Sir Robert Anderson, who actually led the Criminal Investigation Department, they both considered Kosminski a suspect. That's got to carry some weight, right?
I mean, it definitely lends some credibility to his potential candidacy as the Ripper, but suspicion isn't enough for a conviction. And back then, they didn't have the kind of evidence we have today. So why wasn't there enough evidence back then? What were they missing to actually charge him?
So if you look at Swanson's notes, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson was the one leading the Ripper investigation. He specifically identifies Kosminski as the suspect that Anderson was referring to.
Wow, we're really digging through the archives there.
Had to. And according to those notes, Kosminski was supposedly identified by someone who'd actually seen the murderer. And this alleged identification took place at a place they called the Seaside Home. Could have been a police convalescent home, something like that, in Hove.
Wait, hold up. Someone actually saw Jack the Ripper's face, and they pointed the finger at Kosminski. Whoa, that changes things, doesn't it?
Seems like it should, right? But, and there's always a but with this case, isn't there? There's zero official police record of this identification.
Huh.
And to make things even more complicated, Macnaghten, in his memo, wrote that, and I quote, "No one ever saw the Whitechapel murderer."
Okay, so now we've got conflicting accounts from some of the top brass in the police force, a Polish Jewish immigrant suspect with mental health struggles, and a history of, at least some, violence. And we've got this super mysterious seaside home identification. It's like something straight out of a Victorian true crime novel. But remember that DNA evidence you mentioned? Could that be the missing piece, the thing that finally unravels this whole thing?
That's where things get even more complicated, to be honest. A bit messy, even. Next time, we'll unpack the DNA analysis, all the controversy that came with it, and what it might or might not tell us about Aaron Kosminski and his link to Jack the Ripper.
All right, let's get into that DNA, shall we? You mentioned a shawl. What's the story with that?
Yeah, so the DNA evidence, it all revolves around this shawl supposedly found at one of the crime scenes, Catherine Eddowes specifically.
Eddowes, right. One of the, canonical 5 victims we usually attribute to Jack the Ripper. That was a pretty brutal murder, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely one of the more horrific ones for sure. But back to that shawl. So in 2007, a businessman, Russell Edwards, he bought it at an auction. And the story is that this shawl had been passed down through the family of a police officer, one who was at the Eddowes crime scene.
Like a family heirloom with a pretty dark history.
Exactly.
So Edwards, he buys this shawl. What does he decide he's going to be like an amateur detective or something?
Pretty much. He got totally hooked on the case,
Yeah.
the whole Jack the Ripper mystery, and he was convinced this shawl, this was the key to solving it all.
Makes sense.
So he contacted Jerry Llewellyn, a Finnish biochemist who's an expert in, analyzing old DNA, historical DNA.
Okay, so I'm seeing where this is going. They test the shawl, find some DNA, match it to Kosminski. Boom, case closed, right?
Well, if only it were that easy. I mean,
Yeah.
there was a ton of buzz initially. In 2014, Llewellyn, he announced that he'd found mitochondrial DNA on the shawl and that it matched both Eddowes and one of Kosminski's living relatives.
Hold on, mitochondrial DNA. Can you, break that down for those of us who didn't, go to med school?
Sure. Think of it this way. Your mitochondrial DNA, it's like a genetic fingerprint, right? But you get it directly from your mother, and she got it from her mother, and so on. Passed down, mother to child through the maternal line.
Interesting. So in this case, they compared DNA from the shawl to a descendant of Eddowes and a descendant of Kosminski's sister. Basically, they're looking to see if they can trace the DNA back through the mothers, right?
Exactly.
And they found a match on the shawl. That sounds like a pretty big deal.
Oh, it was. The media had a field day. Headlines everywhere were saying that Jack the Ripper had finally been, unmasked.
I can only imagine. But you said it wasn't that simple, right? So what was the problem? Did some scientists disagree or something?
Yeah, they did. And pretty strongly, actually. First of all, there were doubts about the shawl itself. You see, there's no mention of it in the police inventory from the crime scene.
Really?
Nope. And the whole story of how it ended up in the police officer's family, that's based only on, a family legend, not even documented until 100 years after the murders happened.
100 years is a long time. It's like a game of telephone. Who knows how much the story changed over time?
Yeah, you have to wonder if maybe the details got, a bit embellished over the years.
I mean, it happens. So what else? What about the DNA analysis itself? Was there something wrong with that?
Well, for one thing, Llewellyn's original findings, they weren't published in a peer-reviewed journal.
So no other scientists checked his work before it went public?
Not exactly, no. And that peer review, it's a pretty big deal in science because it helps make sure the methods and the results are, solid.
Yeah, without that, it's like, how do you know if you can trust the results,
Right. And what's even more interesting? One of the most vocal critics was actually Alec Jeffreys.
Wait, Alec Jeffreys, the DNA fingerprinting guy, he was against it.
Yeah. Jeffreys and some other scientists, they pointed out a statistical error in the DNA matching. So the variation in the DNA that Llewellyn said was a rare match to Eddowes' descendant, well, it turns out it's not so rare. It's actually present in over 99% of people with European ancestry.
Oh, so not unique at all then?
Nope, not at all. Definitely not the smoking gun everyone thought it was.
So all that hype, all that excitement about DNA solving the case, was it all just a big misunderstanding?
Not completely.
Yeah.
In 2019, Llewellyn and his team, they did publish their results in a peer-reviewed journal, which means, it did get that important check from other scientists. And they still stood by their claim of finding DNA links between the shawl, Eddowes, and Kosminski.
Okay.
But even in the published study, there were a few caveats.
Caveats, like, what do you mean?
Well, for starters, they found 2 discrepancies, mismatches you could say, between the DNA sequence from the shawl and the DNA from Kosminski's descendant. And according to, the usual scientific standards, those differences, they should actually rule out the possibility that the DNA came from the same person.
So even with this official publication, the doubts about the match, they were still there.
Yep. Plus, think about it. This shawl, it's been handled by, I don't even know how many people over the years. Huge risk of contamination there. I mean, anyone who touched it, breathed on it, coughed near it, their DNA could have ended up on that fabric.
Right, so how can you be sure that the DNA they found, how do you know it really belonged to the Ripper or even to the victim? Doesn't it just feel like there's too much room for error?
There is. And to make matters even worse, the journal that published the study, they actually ended up issuing what they called an expression of concern. Basically, because the authors, they couldn't produce their original data.
Oh, so not a good look for the study.
Not really. And this just fueled the doubts about the reliability of the whole study and everything it claimed.
Man, this DNA thing, what a roller coaster. So what do you think? Do you think it actually holds any clues about who Jack the Ripper really was?
You know how they say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? Well, this is a perfect example. The thought that we could finally, put a name to Jack the Ripper's face, it's exciting, sure. But when you really look at the evidence, objectively, there are just too many holes in the story, too many question marks around that DNA analysis. We just can't say for sure, not yet anyway, that the case is closed.
Yeah, can't get carried away. So if we can't really rely on this DNA evidence, what else is there that points to Kosminski being guilty? Where else can we look?
Well, we could turn our attention to Kosminski's mental state. Remember, he was diagnosed with what we call today paranoid schizophrenia. Maybe his condition, maybe that could shed some light on his connection, or lack thereof, to the Ripper crimes.
All right, let's talk about that then. Kosminski's mental state. You said he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. What exactly were his symptoms, and could they have something to do with the Ripper's crimes?
So the asylum records, they paint a pretty vivid, if not unsettling picture of what he was going through. Auditory hallucinations, for one. And he also had this really intense fear of being fed by others. Like he would only eat scraps he found, on the floor.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And refused to wash.
Man, those are some really tough, heartbreaking symptoms. Does it line up with what we know about Jack the Ripper? How he acted, the kinds of crimes he committed?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, the Ripper's crimes, they were savage, no doubt. But they also seemed, well, calculated, methodical even. There's even been some speculation that the Ripper might have had some medical knowledge, based on how he removed organs from some of the victims.
Right, right. But Kosminski, he was a hairdresser. I mean, even a really good one. You're not going to get that kind of anatomical knowledge from cutting hair.
Exactly.
So do you think it's possible, could someone with paranoid schizophrenia, especially with the symptoms Kosminski had, could they have pulled off these really horrific but meticulously planned attacks?
It's tough to say for sure. Mental illness is a complicated thing. And schizophrenia, it can present itself in so many ways. Some people with schizophrenia, they might exhibit violent behavior, but it's not, it's not a given. And even then, the nature of that violence, it can be totally different from case to case.
Okay, so we can't just rule him out because of his mental illness?
Nope. It's definitely something to consider, another piece of the puzzle, but it doesn't give us a simple yes or no answer. Remember those two instances of violence we talked about? The threat to his sister and the incident with the asylum attendant? Those seem more impulsive, reactive even, which kind of clashes with the whole premeditated, organized nature of the Ripper's crimes. But again, two incidents, is that really enough to go on? I don't know.
It's like it's like trying to put together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing and the ones we do have, they're faded. Like, we have all these tantalizing bits of information, but putting them together into a clear picture, it just seems impossible.
Perfect analogy.
Right. So what else? Is there anything else?
Well, there's this theory. It links Kosminski to the murders through his brother.
Oh, okay. I'm listening.
It all has to do with his brother, Isaac. Now, if you believe Russell Edwards, the author, he claims that Isaac was a Freemason.
Freemasons, huh? You mean like the secret society with all the rituals and symbols and all that?
The one and only.
Okay. I'm not seeing the connection. How do Freemasons fit into the whole Jack the Ripper thing?
So Edwards, his theory is that Isaac's Masonic connections, they might have actually protected his brother, shielded him from getting caught, from being arrested.
Interesting.
And then there's that cryptic message that was found near the Eddowes crime scene. It says, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing."
Whoa, that's creepy. And Jews, that's spelled, some people say that's connected to, like, Masonic traditions.
Right.
Is Edward suggesting that the Ripper murders, were they like some kind of, I don't know, some twisted Masonic ritual or something?
Yeah, that's the gist of it. He draws these parallels between the way the Ripper mutilated his victims and Supposedly there's some Masonic rituals that are described in blood oaths, that kind of thing.
Hold on, that's getting into some pretty serious conspiracy theory territory. Is there any evidence to back up this Masonic connection, or is this just pure speculation?
Well, it's definitely a dramatic theory, but like so much in this case, it's really about interpretation, reading between the lines. There's no hard evidence, nothing concrete that directly links Freemasons to the Ripper murders. And even if we assume Isaac Kosminski was a Freemason, that doesn't automatically mean his brother was involved in some, murderous scheme.
True, true. Guilt by association, that's not exactly, a slam dunk.
Exactly.
So where does all this leave us? We've gone through the historical records, the DNA drama, Kosminski's mental state, even a possible Masonic connection. Are we any closer to solving the mystery of Jack the Ripper?
The truth is, even after going through all of this, the case, it's still a mystery. All this evidence we've talked about, it's super interesting, but it's not enough to say for sure one way or the other. The Jack the Ripper case, it just doesn't have easy answers.
It's kind of amazing, isn't it? We have all this technology, all these forensic tools, but we're still stuck with the same questions that baffled those investigators back in 1888. Some mysteries, they just might never be solved.
Yeah, it makes you think, doesn't it?
It does, but that doesn't mean we should stop looking, right?
Absolutely not. And maybe, just maybe, the most important thing we've gotten out of this whole deep dive, maybe it's not a definitive answer. Maybe it's just a deeper understanding of how complicated this whole case is. The Jack the Ripper story, it's not just about a brutal killer. It's a reflection of, of Victorian London, all the anxieties of that time. It's about poverty. It's about fear. It's about how vulnerable women were in that society.
It's so easy to get caught up in the sensationalism, but we can't forget the history, the social context. It reminds us that history, it's not just about dates and names. It's about real people, real lives.
Exactly. And as you keep thinking about this case, consider this. What if? What if Kosminski wasn't alone? What if there was a whole group of people, a network, all working together to carry out the Ripper's reign of terror?
That's a really scary thought, like a conspiracy, a group of people all planning and executing these horrific acts. It's almost too much to think about.
It is dark. But it's something we can't just dismiss, and that gets to the heart of why we're still so fascinated with this case, even after all these years, over a century later, and we're still captivated, still trying to understand those shadows in Whitechapel. The mystery, it lives on.
It definitely does. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder this enduring enigma, all its layers. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Jack the Ripper. Until next time, keep those questions coming.